Before the blade ever touched her neck, Marie Antoinette's fate was already sealed. Ending her life wasn't enough. They wanted her identity erased, her dignity crushed, her name dragged through the streets as a lesson. The woman who once lit up Versailles with laughter and silk was being forced to walk history backward, from a golden throne to a splintered cart meant for the condemned. If you're here for real history, where innocence gets destroyed quietly before it gets destroyed loudly, subscribe. Because this isn't a myth. It's the slow breaking of a young woman the world chose to hate. Before the screams, before the blade, she was just a girl, frightened, isolated, and already condemned. Comment where you're watching from, and stay with me. Because her execution wasn't the real tragedy. What came before it was far worse. In the early hours of August 2nd, 1793, while Paris still slept under a thick, uneasy silence, they tore her away from her family. No goodbye. No moment to hold her children. Just hands pulling her down a corridor, through iron doors into the Conciergerie, a damp, shadowed prison Parisians called the waiting room of the Guillotine. There was no queen anymore. Only prisoner number 280. Her new court was rats in the corners, sweating stone walls, and 2 guards who never looked away. Every step she took was watched. Every breath, timed. Even her smallest attempts at dignity were blocked like crimes. The hours didn't pass so much as blur, measured only by the thud of boots outside her door and the steady drip of water from the ceiling. Somewhere beyond those walls, the revolution roared. People who once bowed to her embroidered gowns now shouted for her head. But inside that cell, another story unfolded, one the crowds never wanted to see. The story of the woman behind the symbol. Time no longer meant clocks. It meant cold mornings and colder nights. The scrape of keys, the shuffle of guards switching posts. Antoinette lived in a cramped cell soaked with moisture. Damp clung to everything, walls, blankets, even her skin. A pile of straw served as her bed. A single candle was her only companion. A wooden screen split the room in half, supposedly for modesty, a flimsy promise of privacy. But even that shred was denied. 2 soldiers stood inside day and night. She dressed under their eyes, slept under their eyes, ate under their eyes. The surveillance wasn't just control, it was humiliation. A constant reminder she was no longer queen, no longer mother, barely even considered human, just a body waiting to be processed. News from the outside came in scraps, muffled voices in corridors, distorted gossip slipping under the door. But one memory stayed vivid, sharp as glass. Her son. Only weeks earlier, in the Temple prison, revolutionaries had stormed into his room after midnight. She had thrown herself over him pleading, "He's only a child." It meant nothing. Guards ripped her away while the terrified 8-year-old was dragged from her arms. His screams didn't fade. They lived inside her, replaying endlessly in the dark. She would never see him again. Something broke that night. Not the queen, but the mother. She hid almost nothing from the guards, because they took almost everything. But she managed to keep a tiny portrait of Louis Charles and a lock of his hair tucked inside her corset. It was her relic, the last ember of warmth in a world frozen by fury. Her only real kindness came from a young servant named Rosalie Lamorlière, assigned to care for her. Rosalie later said the former queen barely cried, except when her children were mentioned. Then the mask of royalty slipped away, and what was left was a devastated mother whispering their names like prayers. Even that grief became a game for her captors. The guards mocked her, tossed crude insults, laughed about her executed husband. Every word was meant to push the knife deeper. Every silence from her was an act of resistance. And in that suffocating cell, surrounded by hatred, Antoinette began to bend her pain into defiance. She learned to move slowly, speak softly, show nothing. The men watching her expected a shattered woman. Instead, they saw someone who, even stripped of crown and title, still carried an eerie, wordless authority. Not arrogance, something stranger. The leftover gravity of someone who had once ruled and still refused to collapse. Some nights, when the prison settled into a restless quiet, she stared into her candle's trembling flame and replayed her life. The glittering balls, the orchestra-filled halls, her children laughing in palace gardens, and the rising tide of resentment swelling just outside Versailles. When did it all unravel? When did they stop being people and become monsters in the public imagination? No answer came, only dawn, and with it, another day inside that tiny stone coffin. Outside, she heard Paris waking up, street vendors shouting, revolutionary drums rolling in the distance, church bells from Notre Dame cutting through the foggy air. Life moved on, indifferent to her suffering, and so the days stacked up, 76 of them. 76 mornings without hope. During those weeks, the woman once despised by an entire nation was stripped of everything that made her human. And yet, from that stripping, something unexpected formed. A quiet composure, a dignity that only appears in those who have already lost everything and have nothing left to fear. Then October came, and the cell door opened. This time, not to take a child, to take her to trial. Before dawn on October 14th, 1793, the iron door groaned open and armed soldiers filled the corridor. She was led through the Conciergerie's passageways, boots echoing against stone like a funeral march. She wore the same black dress she'd used to mourn her husband. It hung looser now on her thin frame. Her hair had gone pale, but her steps stayed calm, almost unnervingly calm. People watched her from shadowed corners. Some spat. Others just stared, stuck between hatred and a weird, reluctant fascination. The Revolutionary Tribunal was less a courtroom than a stage. Torches flickered along the walls, throwing hard light across the judges' faces, rigid, expressionless, carved from ideology. The gallery was packed, hungry for spectacle. And on a plain wooden bench sat the woman who had once been Queen of France. No jewels, no crown, only a pale figure with a ghost-like dignity that refused to die. Prosecutor Antoine Quentin Fouquier-Tinville opened with a voice built for theater. Every word was delivered like a blade, every sentence crafted to pull cheers from the crowd. He listed the charges in a practiced rhythm: treason, conspiracy with foreign enemies, bleeding France dry, corrupting the nation's morals. The room erupted with jeers and fists, but facts didn't matter. The revolution needed a villain, a body to carry the anger of hunger, taxes, war, and fear. And she was the emblem they'd chosen. Denied proper counsel and given no time to prepare, Antoinette spoke only when allowed. Her voice was quiet, steady, worn down not by guilt, but by the exhaustion of someone who knows the ending is already written. Witnesses came one after another. Some repeated stories lifted straight from hate pamphlets. Others invented new ones on the spot. They painted Versailles as a den of decadence, described feasts and mockery and cruelty. The audience devoured it. Every scandal, whether real or imagined, fed the same hunger: to see her destroyed. Then came the accusation that froze the room. Tinville lifted a paper, paused for effect, and announced the vilest charge of all, that she had committed incest with her own son. A chilling silence fell over the tribunal. Even hardened revolutionaries looked away. Word rippled through the gallery like poison. Louis Charles, her little boy, had been forced into signing a false confession, coached to repeat horrifying phrases he didn't understand. Sentences designed not just to condemn her, but to break her as a mother. For a moment, Antoinette didn't move. She sat perfectly still, staring into nothing, as if the air had vanished. The judges waited. The crowd held its breath. Then she stood. She didn't look at the prosecutor, didn't plead to the jury. She turned instead toward the women in the audience. Market women, mothers, the same kind who had once marched to Versailles demanding bread. And in a voice clear as a bell, she said, "I appeal to all the mothers who are here." Nothing more. She didn't need to. A wave moved through the room. Murmurs, gasps, even tears. For one raw instant, the monstrous caricature from endless pamphlets vanished. What stood there wasn't a symbol of corruption. It was a mother, humiliated beyond comprehension. Tinville slammed his fist down, furious at the shift in mood, and forced the trial onward. But something had cracked. A flicker of humanity or guilt passed across a few faces. Antoinette sank back into her seat, drained. That single moment had cost her the last of her strength. Still, the performance had to finish. The trial dragged on for 2 days, every question choreographed, every witness a prop for a verdict already carved in stone. The tribunal wasn't searching for truth. It was staging an ending, and dawn on October 16th was waiting just outside the door. At dawn on October 16th, 1793, the judges finally read the verdict the city had been rehearsing for months. Guilty of high treason. Sentence: death by guillotine. The clerk asked if she had anything to say. Antoinette stared forward, hollow-eyed, and whispered, "What more could I add? No screaming, no collapse, no desperate bargaining for life. Just a quiet acceptance that somehow felt like resistance. A woman standing straighter than the men who condemned her, as if her silence carried more truth than the entire courtroom's noise." That afternoon, they marched her back through the same damp corridors to cell 280. Behind her, the cheers, the accusations, the triumphant cries of a crowd that believed it had finally found its scapegoat. Ahead of her, the final night of her life. Paris fell into darkness on October 15th with a deceptive calm. But inside the Conciergerie, time felt brutally sharp. The silence was so thick that even the dripping water sounded like a clock counting down her last hours. Antoinette returned from the trial, pale and trembling. Her body looked ready to give out, but her gaze was strangely peaceful. Not hopeful, but settled, like someone who had already stepped beyond fear. Rosalie stayed close, her eyes swollen from crying. She offered her broth, a piece of bread. The former queen smiled gently and shook her head. "I need nothing more, my child. Everything is finished for me." For a long while she sat at the small wooden table, watching shadows flicker across the damp wall. The Seine murmured outside. Guards paced beyond the door. Somewhere in Paris, people were already talking about the execution as if it were tomorrow's weather. Then she reached for a quill. Her hand trembled, but her writing stayed steady. She began a letter to her sister-in-law, Madame Elisabeth, one of the last people she still loved without politics tangled in it. And in that letter, there was no vengeance, no fear, no curse thrown at her enemies, only forgiveness. She begged Elizabeth to care for her daughter, to pray for Louis Charles, and most painfully, to never blame the boy for what he had been forced to say. "He has been misled," she wrote, "used as a pawn by those who wished to torment me." Her words softened into something almost otherworldly. "Tell him I do not blame him. Tell him I pray for him. Tell him that even in heaven, I will still be his mother." With every line, it was like her spirit drifted farther from her exhausted body. The letter wasn't a plea. It was a final moral testament. Her last attempt to leave something clean behind in a world that wanted her stained. But it never reached Elizabeth. Revolutionaries seized it, filed it away in their archives, buried under hatred. It would remain hidden for more than 2 decades before anyone saw what she had written. When she laid the quill down, she looked at the candle beside her. Wax had pooled and trailed across the table like tears. Rosalie noticed and broke. "Do not cry," Antoinette told her softly. "We must die as we have lived, decently." Not long after midnight, footsteps returned. Their final order had arrived. The guards delivered it with chilling normalcy, like announcing a routine transfer, not an execution. Antoinette only nodded. No tremor, no appeal for mercy. Before they shut the door again, she asked for one moment alone. She knelt. She prayed, not for herself, but for her children. At that instant, she was no symbol, no queen, no villain from pamphlets. She was simply a mother preparing to let go. When she rose, dawn was already slipping through the cracks in the stone. Paris was waking up, indifferent to her sorrow. In the streets, people spoke about bread, politics, and the coming spectacle, unaware that the woman who once ruled the grandest court in Europe was quietly fixing her hair with shaking hands and preparing, with eerie calm, to die. Before drifting into a brief, restless half-sleep, Rosalie heard her murmur, "May God give me the strength to die with courage." Then the candle went out. Its last glow hovered in the darkness like a fading promise. She didn't dream. She just waited. At sunrise, bolts clanged, locks scraped. The end of waiting had come. October 16th, 1793, Paris woke under a heavy, icy fog, as if the sky itself hesitated to watch what the next hours would bring. In cell 280, Antoinette stirred before the guards arrived. She had slept only minutes, her head resting on the same wooden table where her unread letter still lay. Rosalie entered with a cup of water. "Would you like breakfast, Your Majesty?" Antoinette shook her head gently. "No. Once I am gone, I need nothing more. My soul has fed enough on sorrow." At precisely 6 o'clock, the locks turned. The door opened. The jailer stepped in and said bluntly, "It is time." 3 men followed, an official clerk, a National Guard officer, and the executioner himself, Charles-Henri Sanson, flanked by assistants. Everything was arranged with cold, ritual precision, a final performance meant to strip away whatever was left of her dignity before the streets could do the rest. The guard informed her she must change, remove the black mourning dress she had worn since her husband's death. That dress wasn't just cloth, it was her memory, her last link to a life already erased. She asked quietly for privacy. "Sir, please, allow me at least that." The guard laughed. "There are no queens here." She was forced to change behind a poorly placed screen while they watched. The black dress fell away, and they handed her a rough white linen gown, the color of penitents, of criminals, of those about to die. The contrast was deliberate, merciless. The woman once wrapped in silk and jewels now looked almost spectral in borrowed white. When she was dressed, Sanson stepped forward, voice flat and detached. "Your hair must be cut, madame." She didn't protest. She simply bowed her head. Her hands, once glittering with rings, folded quietly in her lap. Rusty scissors hacked through her hair. Pale strands fell to the floor like pieces of her past. Once golden, now white from grief and time. The cutting wasn't only preparation, it was symbolic erasure, the last step of turning a queen into a nameless body. Sanson dropped the hair without a glance. Then a guard approached, holding a thick rope. "We must bind your hands." Antoinette looked up, stunned. "Why?" she asked softly. "My husband, the king, was not bound." There wasn't rebellion in her voice, only sorrow. No answer came. They tied her wrists so tightly, the rope bit into her skin. She swallowed a quiet hiss of pain, refusing to give them the satisfaction of a cry. Before leaving, she made one last request, something she never would have imagined speaking aloud at court. "May I relieve myself for a moment?" They nodded with open disdain. Humiliation was complete. Even the most basic human act had become part of the spectacle. When she returned, the men straightened. Sanson said simply, "We must go." Antoinette turned toward Rosalie. The young servant was trembling, cheeks wet, mouth unable to form words. Antoinette looked at her with tenderness that felt almost maternal. "Do not weep for me. I have suffered too much to fear death. God bless you." Then she stepped into the corridor. The passageways of the Conciergerie echoed with whispers, footsteps, dread. As she passed, guards removed their hats. No one met her eyes. Not out of fear. Out of something involuntary. Respect. Something in her presence demanded silence. At the main gate, she saw the cart waiting. An open, rough wooden wagon, the kind used for thieves and murderers. There would be no closed carriage for her, no attempt at decency. Her husband had been taken to his death in a covered coach. She was being offered to the city as a public display. The morning air bit cold against her skin. Bells blended with distant shouts as the streets began to fill. Her wrists were still bound. She climbed into the cart without help. For a brief moment, she lifted her face to the gray sky, inhaled slowly, and whispered so softly only Rosalie could hear, "Now my peace begins." The courthouse doors groaned open. The cart rolled forward, and the last journey of Marie Antoinette began. The wooden cart creaked into motion, pulled by two tired horses through streets already choking with people. Mud stained the wagon's sides, along with darker traces left by prisoners who'd ridden it before her. Inside, Marie Antoinette stood upright, hands bound, her plain white gown snapping in the wind. Her freshly cut hair exposing that long, fragile neck everyone had come to see forever silenced. The slow ride from the Conciergerie to the Place de la Révolution lasted a little over an hour. For the thousands lining the roads, it wasn't a transfer, it was a procession. They wanted a spectacle. They wanted proof that the woman they'd blamed for their hunger and grief was finally broken. Some screamed insults until their throats went raw. Others hurled stale bread, rotten fruit, clumps of mud. "There goes the Austrian whore! The widow Capet! The thief of France!" But what disturbed many of them wasn't her presence. It was her silence. She didn't flinch at the shouting, didn't scan the crowd for pity, didn't bow her head as if ashamed. She stood as though the cart were not a cage, but a platform, still, composed, gaze fixed far ahead. The hatred crashed around her like waves on rock, and she refused to move. Artists and chroniclers later wrote that her profile that day didn't show arrogance. It showed something colder, calmer, an unsettling peace. A woman who seemed to have already crossed a line where pain couldn't reach her anymore. From a balcony, a young man watched intently. Jacques-Louis David, painter of the Revolution, opened his sketchbook. He drew fast, trying to capture not just her shape, but the exact moment when history became myth. The long neck, the firm jaw, the hollow but steady eyes. That sketch would live longer than the slogans and cheers below. The cart rolled on, down Rue Saint-Honoré, guarded by lines of soldiers. Windows opened and slammed shut as it passed. Some faces were twisted with open hatred. Others held a strange, guilty restraint, like they weren't sure if they were watching justice or something darker. Hooves clattered against stone. Vendors shouted. Church bells tolled. The city felt like it was holding its breath even while pretending it wasn't. The wagon hit a rough patch of road and jolted violently. Antoinette stumbled, nearly falling. A ripple of murmurs moved through the crowd, some eager, some surprised. But she straightened herself without help, lifting her chin as if nothing had happened. Nearby, market women watched her closely. These were the same kind of women who had once marched to Versailles demanding bread and dragging royalty back to Paris. "She doesn't look afraid," one muttered. "Maybe she has nothing left to lose," another answered. And that was the truth. The journey felt endless, noise everywhere. Yet inside her, there was a strange stillness. While the crowd saw a humiliated queen, she felt something else. Something unexpected. Freedom. Not freedom from prison, but from everything that had trapped her long before the bars. The poisonous court gossip, the constant expectations, the endless rumors that had swallowed her name whole, even from fear itself. In the face of a death she could not escape, she was finally beyond the reach of those who'd tormented her for years. Then the cart turned one final corner, and the square opened before her. The Place de la Révolution was packed so tightly it seemed to breathe. Bodies pressed together, buzzing with anticipation. At the center rose the guillotine, towering against the pale sky. A dark wooden frame, a blade that caught the light like a cold smile. It was silent and ready. The murmur of the crowd swelled into a roar. Antoinette lifted her chin. For a heartbeat, the noise fell away. The wind brushed her cheek. The blade glinted above her. She understood that everything she had ever been, queen, wife, mother, was about to end on that platform. But she also understood something else. Her story no longer belonged to the people who dragged her here. The cart stopped. Executioner Charles-Henri Sanson stepped down first with his assistants. One of them offered a hand to help her descend. She met his eyes and said softly, "No, thank you. I can manage on my own." With bound wrists and steady feet, she climbed down. The crowd thundered with shouts, fists raised, laughter sharp with the thrill of watching an era die. The guillotine loomed above her. She looked at it. There was no terror in her face, only that remarkable, almost otherworldly calm. She began up the wooden steps slowly. Her tied hands made her movements awkward, but she refused help. Sanson moved to guide her toward the plank, and then fate took its last cruel little swing. As she turned, her foot brushed against his. It was nothing, one small misstep. But in that instant, everything froze. The executioner blinked, startled. The nearest assistants paused. Even the crowd seemed to inhale. Antoinette stopped and looked at him, and she spoke her final words. "Forgive me, sir. I did not do it on purpose." No curse, no scream, no pleading, just an apology. Simple, gentle, almost polite. It stunned everyone. That tiny moment did more than 1,000 speeches ever could. In the face of a machine built to reduce her to a symbol, she became human again. Not a monster, not a saint. Just a woman who had lived through humiliation and still knew how to offer grace. It was her last triumph. Because in that breath, stripped of crown, children, identity, even her name, she reclaimed the one thing they could never confiscate: her dignity. The assistants laid her on the wooden plank. The air around the scaffold tightened with hunger and dread. Somewhere in the crowd, a voice screamed, "Long live the Republic!" Thousands roared it back. Sanson gave the signal. The mechanism snapped with a harsh metallic crack. A heartbeat later, the blade fell, ruthless, precise. Her body went still. The executioner lifted her head by its pale hair and raised it high for the masses to see. A violent cheer rolled across the square. "Long live the nation! Long live liberty!" For them, it was the victory of the revolution. For her, it was release. Witnesses later whispered they saw something strange in her expression even after death. Peace lingering on her face, a calm untouched by violence. Some claimed the sky darkened as the blade fell, as though the city itself hesitated to accept what it had done. Her body was placed in a covered cart with the remains of others executed earlier. No prayers, no coffin, no marker. She was taken to the Madeleine Cemetery and tossed into a mass grave among strangers, queens and thieves equalized by dirt. No flowers, no cross, only silence. The crowd dispersed slowly, still buzzing, still hungry for the next name. The thud of marching boots faded. The trapdoor of the guillotine closed with a hollow finality, and the square, which had just erupted with history, began to look ordinary again. Just stone, wind, and an empty platform. But that wasn't the end of her story. They buried her like a criminal. They erased her name from official records. They believed they had ended her forever. But symbols don't stay underground. Time passed. The revolution devoured many of its own architects. Robespierre fell. Tribunals dissolved. The guillotine's thunder finally quieted. And as France searched for itself in the ruins, the victims it had celebrated killing began to transform into martyrs. It was said a young sculptor was summoned after her execution to capture her features in wax. Marie Grossholtz, later known as Madame Tussaud, molded the former queen's face, preserving her likeness while her enemies turned to dust. Art, even when born from something morbid, can outlive hate. In 1815, more than 20 years after her death, the brother of Louis XVI, now King Louis XVIII, ordered a search for the remains of the king and queen. In a forgotten corner of the Madeleine Cemetery, 2 skeletons were unearthed. One, identified partly by scraps of white cloth and the bound position of the wrists, was recognized as Marie Antoinette. At last, the woman denied a tomb was given one. Her remains were brought to the Basilica of Saint-Denis, the traditional resting place of French monarchs. But even that wasn't the true conclusion. Because beyond monuments and myths, something deeper survived. The paradox of a woman who embodied both privilege and suffering. She wasn't a saint, and she wasn't the monster her enemies invented. She was an imperfect human being caught in the jaws of history, turned into a symbol, blamed for an era's collapse, and then punished not just with death, but with public erasure. Yet the people who tried hardest to wipe her away ended up giving her a strange immortality. Her final act, an apology to the man about to kill her, endures as a quiet lesson that still stings through the centuries. Compassion can be a form of resistance. Thus ended the life of the queen who lost everything: throne, children, identity. And yet, in the final heartbeat when steel met flesh, she gained the one thing no power on earth can steal: dignity. Centuries will pass, empires will collapse, names will fade. But in every story of power and downfall, in every echo of injustice, there will remain a whisper. There was once a woman who met the hatred of the world with grace. If this story moved you, support the channel by subscribing and liking the video. Marie Antoinette has been judged for centuries, but rarely understood. Share your thoughts about her in the comments. History remembers her as a name. What do you remember her as?